Welcome, everybody, to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is the leader of Three Down Nation, as well as CFL Insider Justin Dunk. Justin, thanks for being on today's episode. I'm really glad that you had the time to come on and grace us with your presence and your infinite CFL wisdom.
I don't know about that, but thanks for having me on. Jacked up, let's get after it.
So first things first, we got a crazy amount of free agent signings that have been happening in the CFL. The Bombers, after a dormant first few weeks, have woken up and really been able to snag a bunch of amazing contracts and tons of very generous restructuring, I must say, from some veteran leaders. What do you see as the Bombers' outlook for the ability to repeat potentially in 2021?
Well, first of all, as you mentioned, the fact that they've been able to keep essentially all those key players that were a part of the 2019 Grey Cup run has been a great job by Kyle Walters and also Mike O'Shea, and a tribute to the culture that he's made there. So I think it sets the Bombers up that if we do actually play football in 2021, to be a legit contender in the West and be able to defend that Grey Cup title. When you look at it, Zach Calero's going to be back behind center. Yes, he only played those 4 games in 2019, but obviously the most critical ones and came through in clutch situations. Are going to lean on Andrew Harris again. Most of the offensive line is under contract. You might see some tinkering there with some of the depth guys, but what I'm most curious to see for them on offense is, do they go out and look to potentially add a playmaker? Greg Ellingson might hit the free agent market. Brian Burnham's another one, because largely on defense as well, they brought that group back. And then I would imagine they're hoping for some young Americans to step up, whether those are rookies or guys that were on the roster before. So overall, the Bombers looking pretty legit to try to defend.
And with some of the other free agent signings and potential free agents opening up, Darrell Walker is back in Edmonton after departing from Toronto. And you especially look now at people talking about Ottawa and Toronto, with them Toronto having struggled back-to-back 4-14 seasons, in Ottawa having come off their second worst season in new franchise history. But Paul LaPolice, Ryan Dinwiddie leading the helm in both the respective Ontario clubs. Is there a big rebound in store for either of those teams in the East, or who do you think is going to be the team to compete with Hamilton? Because Montreal has looked good, but there's a bit of uncertainty as to if Vernon Adams can repeat the magic that he put on in 2019.
Certainly, as it stands right now, Hamilton is going to be the team to contend with in the East for first place. And I don't think I can give you an honest prediction until this quarterback situation gets figured out. There's a stare down going down in Ottawa between Nick Arbuckle and the Red Blacks in terms of restructuring the contract. The Argos have Matt Nichols under contract, but he's due a bonus on February 1st, just like Arbuckle is. So there could be some quarterback movement here that will decide ultimately how good those teams in Ottawa and Toronto will be. So I'll withhold judgment for now, but I'll definitely come back on and give you my perspective after we know who the quarterbacks are going to be, because what's at play right now is it's not for certain that Nick Arbuckle is necessarily in a Red Blacks uniform. And he obviously has the connection to Ryan Dinwiddie with the Calgary Stampeders. Dinwiddie was a quarterbacks coach there for a number of years before he was hired as a head man in Toronto. So if Arbuckle goes down the 401 to the Argos, who ends up in Ottawa? A lot of people think Matt Nichols could be there because of his connection with Paul LaPolice and his knowledge of the LaPolice offense from their days together in Winnipeg. And then nobody's talking about McLeod Bethel-Thompson, who is a free agent, a guy that led the league in touchdown passes last year. Yes, it was a terrible Argos team in terms of the record, but the fact that Bethel-Thompson was able to be so productive has some people intrigued, although I get the sense he's being looked at as more of a backup option. And then I would argue the biggest one, the number one pending free agent on our rankings at Three Down Nation, is Jeremiah Masoli. Do the Ticats bring him back, or does he look elsewhere to potentially get paid as much as he can in this COVID-19 market?
And the quarterback situation that is brewing in Hamilton is definitely amongst the most interesting in the league, considering that Dane Evans stepped in and did very well in place of Masoli after he was out for the rest of the season with once he was injured. But the real question is Hamilton a different team than they were last year if Masoli's at the helm? Because he is a bit older than Dane Evans. And so would he be able to continue the success that he had before leaving the season due to injury? Or would he be not as much the same as he was prior?
Well, the proof is going to be when he actually steps out on the field. But if it were me, I would rather have Jeremiah Masoli as my number one quarterback, whether that's Hamilton, Ottawa, and Toronto. And I would imagine there's going to potentially be competing offers there. If the Ticats let him get to free agency, it might drive the price up. I'd rather have Masoli as my starter over Dane Evans. It's proven that when Masoli's on the field with that Ticats offense, they're much more dangerous. Dane Evans was solid, has a lot of potential. Don't get me wrong, but Masoli more proven, even though, yes, he's coming off the ACL injury that was largely non-contact. He's had by the time he gets back on the field, about 2 years since that injury occurred. So I expect him to be back at full health. He's been training and is ready to go. So I'd rather have Masoli, especially when you consider that Hamilton is scheduled to host a Grey Cup in 2021. And we all know that you got to have largely two quarterbacks to get through a season in case your number one goes down. So I would want to have Masoli if I'm the Ticats.
If Masoli ended up being decided as the number one quarterback in Steeltown, would there be a potential that Dane Evans would look elsewhere to find a better opportunity? Or do you think that he would be content with settling for being the number two position after the season that he had leading them to the Grey Cup?
He's under contract in Hamilton, so he really doesn't have much of a choice there. And the Ticats were smart. They got him at a bargain rate on the 3-year deal that he signed. Now, it was restructured, but still, it's a bargain rate for a quarterback when you look at the total money that he could potentially make. And it's really laden with playtime incentives, too. So Dane Evans doesn't really have much of a say here unless he wants to try to force a trade. And I just don't foresee that happening because he's been brought up in that Tommy Condell offense there in Hamilton, and they really like his skill set. And you want to have options at the quarterback position. So in an ideal world, the Ticats, from their perspective, would like to have Masoli and Evans make sure they're strong at the quarterback position going forward. But the market might decide if that's going to happen or not.
And if the opportunity did present itself for Dane Evans to maybe be packaged in a trade, that would be definitely interesting, similar to when Levi Mitchell was out for the first handful of games for Calgary in 2019. And then Arbuckle stepped in, played well, and then all of a sudden the alarm bells started going off in the front offices of franchises in desperate for a signal caller. You especially see now with Nick Arbuckle having made the splash to go to Ottawa for the time being. Off that small sample size, is there a bit of a risk that you find in the sample size of some of these quarterbacks play before they become franchise QBs? Or do you think it's a necessary swing that some of these teams have to take on a small number of games?
It's definitely a necessary swing because there's not really any other guys out there with the experience that you could go with, but it's also risky. And I believe that's part of the reason why the Red Blacks are taking a hard line stance with Arbuckle. They're looking out there and saying, oh, well, if we could have a shot potentially at getting a Jeremiah Masoli or a Matt Nichols coming off that shoulder injury, even a McLeod Bethel Thompson has more games under his belt than Nick Arbuckle, then is that more worth our money? Because really outside of those players, there's not a lot of quarterback experience on the market. So you got to pick one and roll with it. So I think overall you're bang on there. There's certainly some risk, but you look at the quarterbacks that have gotten some big money deals, especially after the 2019 season. Cody Fajardo has done it for less than 1 full year. And there were a lot of question marks coming out of that week 1 game in 2019 when Fajardo, everyone forgets, was benched for Isaac Harker. And going into week 2 in Ottawa, a lot of people thought Harker should get the start. But credit to the Riders, they gave Fajardo a week to have all of the reps with the first team offense. He throws for 400 yards and goes on to have a very strong season. But people want to see him back it up until you anoint him as a franchise guy, much like you mentioned earlier with Vernon Adams Jr. Has 1 strong season for Montreal under his belt, not quite a full one because Antonio Pipkin started the year as the number 1 guy there, but people want to see, can he do it again? Can he continue to have those magical plays that are off schedule out of the pocket and maybe cut down the interceptions? That's what they're looking for out of Vernon Adams Jr. So you sort of have two, I would say maybe three tiers of quarterbacks in the league right now. Let's say three. You have your franchise legit dudes that have either won a Grey Cup or gone to Grey Cups. Mike Riley, Bo Levi Mitchell, Trevor Harris would be in that boat. And then the next tier, I would have Jeremiah Masoli at the top of it. You have Cody Fajardo and Vernon Adams Jr., who are guys that have either helped get their teams to a Grey Cup. Masoli didn't play in it, obviously, but he helped get the Ticats there. And then you have Fajardo, who leads the Riders to first place in the West, and Vernon Adams Jr., who gets Montreal in the playoffs for the first time in a long time. And then you have that next tier of guys that we've been focused on. Nick Arbuckle, that doesn't have that amount of performance under his belt, but people see a lot of potential. McLeod Bethel Thompson would fall in that group as well. So a lot of different mixes. I mean, Zach Collaros would definitely be in that second tier. I should throw him in there. Obviously kind of forgot him a little bit, but those are sort of the tiers as I see them.
And on the flip side of that, I remember back a few years ago in free agency, there was a big buzz around James Franklin when he was a backup at Edmonton for Mike Riley. Now he struggled with the Argos, and then they turned to the CFL version of Fitzmagic, who does have the great resemblance in the boom bust performance level. Now, James Franklin is in a bit of an interesting situation now with him having been extended by Saskatchewan as a bit more of a clipboard holder. But while him still being a bit young, maybe not over the hump of 30 plus, is there still potential for James Franklin to turn it around and make a bit of a name for himself in the league, or has the ship sailed on him?
I think there's definitely still potential there. And in Toronto, it was a much different situation than when he was in Edmonton, because I just don't think philosophically he got along with Mark Trestman. And that got things set off on the wrong foot. And a lot of people will say, well, you got to be a pro and you still have to perform. But when you're not allowed to be yourself, whether that's football or anything else that you're doing in this world or that you choose to do, and your boss just doesn't let you be you, it makes you uncomfortable immediately, right away. So that was the feeling with Mark Trestman. And that's why I believe it's smart for Franklin to stick with Jason Moss, the offensive coordinator in Saskatchewan, whether it's a year of holding the clipboard or not, sort of rehabilitate, get his confidence back, get back with the guy that had him at that level where people saw him as that next potential franchise guy and star in the league, and then see where the quarterback situation is after the 2021 season, because he's got all the skills you would want. He can run the football. He showed that with Toronto. He was their short yardage guy, led the league in rushing touchdowns 1 year with the Argos. He's got the strong arm. The physical abilities are there, and he showed some of the mental capabilities when he was with Edmonton. Mark Trestman's scheme is very complicated, and it's difficult for a quarterback to pick up right away. So I also think that was going against him a little bit, that they expected so much so quickly. So I think it's smart what he's done, rehabilitate, get the confidence back, and then I still think he has that potential.
And speaking of quarterbacks staying with their offensive coordinators, Dominique Davis extended in Ottawa, staying with Paul LaPolice, or as he has come into town now, so he gets the opportunity to be reunited with him. What is Dominique Davis's potential as a starting quarterback in the CFL? And would there be a legitimacy for him to be the starter on Ottawa in the long term if Nick Arbuckle's situation doesn't get settled for him to stay in the nation's capital?
A lot of people forget too that Dominique Davis has thrown passes in the NFL and was in the NFL for a decent stint down there. And he's another guy that wasn't in the best way when the Ottawa Red Blacks, the team of 2019, was on the field. They did an offensive coordinator by committee approach that never really worked. They brought back Joe Paopao, who had been out of the league for a number of years, even out of football for a couple too. His stop before that was at the University of Waterloo. And there were some people that felt like, maybe the game had passed him by. And I think we saw that. So Pauling Dew being shifted around, October did it for a little bit. So look at Davis through that lens. And I think it's because Davis is a guy that has a skill set that I think really saw early in the season in 2019, the performances that he had, especially against the Riders, and then somehow pulling that upset against the Stampeders, that the ability is certainly there for Davis. And you wonder if part of the Red Blacks' hardline stance with Arbuckle is because they're looking at Dominique Davis, value quarterback, who they could put some pieces around and potentially play. Do I think that's the way it's going to go? Likely not. But Davis is a really nice number 2 to have there and potentially an emergency quarterback.
I didn't know the part about him throwing passes in the NFL. That's very interesting. And I found when he was here in Winnipeg that he played quite well in the preseason and had the arm strength and the physical capability to get there. But again, the offensive coordinator by committee was definitely a failed experiment in Ottawa. And the proof is in the pudding. 3-15 is nowhere that you want to be finishing in the CFL, especially in the East, with the potential to take advantage of maybe the weaker ride, so to speak, that they have during the current power shift in the CFL with it being top heavy in the West. So it's so interesting to see what potential outcomes may be for the 2021 season, barring that it happens, because like you mentioned, until we see guys get on the field and get back out there, it's really difficult to tell who's going to take Hamilton down in the East. Will Winnipeg be able to repeat their success with Collaros during a full season? Will the Stampeders be able to rebound from the shocking upset that they suffered in the West semifinal? Will the Riders finally be able to overcome winning a home playoff game? All these sorts of questions will be answered and once we return to football, but there is a lot of uncertainty, and I'm sure that it may be difficult even for yourself to be able to kind of garner what results may come without us having seen football in almost 2 years by next season.
It's tricky. And you got to look at the 2019 season as well. Out in BC, Mike Riley was hurt near the end of the year. There was that young coaching staff led by Devon Claybrook. So a lot of change has gone on there. Bo Levi Mitchell was hurt with the Calgary Stampeders. So a lot of people felt like the Saskatchewan Roughriders had an easier ride than normal in the West. And people around the league believe it might be difficult for the Riders to replicate that 13-5 record in first place in the West Division. The Bombers seem to be rock solid because they've been right in there competing for top spot in the West year in and year out since Mike O'Shea has really established himself there along with Kyle Walters, and they got the roster churn in the way that they want it and the culture also built. So I think we can expect the Bombers to certainly be competitive and legitimately be threats to repeat. But as you said, in the East, it gets much more tricky because you're looking at Hamilton bringing back a large part of their pieces so far, and we're in mid-January, to that roster that was dominant, went 15-3 in Orlando Steinauer's first season in the CFL as a head coach. So a lot of uncertainty, but we got to get back on the field first, man. Fingers crossed. Hopefully that can happen.
So now I want to transition a little bit here to talk a little bit more about yourself. So you are in charge of 3 Down Nation. Was it a project that you started back when you were in university, or what came to be of your involvement with the website and your desire to get more content about Canadian football out?
Yeah, I certainly can't take credit for starting it. That credit all needs to go to Drew Edwards, who's a former Hamilton Spectator reporter, was the beat man for the Ticats for a number of years. So while he was covering the Ticats, and I used to read this blog every day, he had what was called the Scratching Post blog. And his goal was that he always had one piece of content, small, big, large, or otherwise. And a lot of the days it was multiple because he covered the team in such a great way that he wanted to have at least one piece of content on there. So I remember reading it every day. And then he thought, well, there's a bit of a lack of content out there and a gathering place for it at the league level. He was doing it obviously just for one team. CFL.ca does their thing, but with all due respect to them, and I've written and worked for CFL.ca before, it has to be largely positive. And you can break down football a little bit, but you can't really tell the real hard-hitting news stories and what's going on with the league at CFL.ca. It makes sense, right? It's the league's website. TSN.ca does a lot of stuff, especially in season, but what Drew saw was sort of a lack of an outside entity that wasn't covering the league that didn't have a relationship with the league. TSN is close with them, obviously, because of the television contract. So he started up Three Down Nation and actually started as a group of fans, and Drew managed that and put it together and grew it up. And he saw in terms of reporting on CFL, quite often once, I see you putting all this stuff out on Twitter, and that's, maybe not necessarily going to get you to where you want to go. So what would you think about coming over to Three Down Nation in a part-time role? This is while I was working at Sportsnet full-time, so I could do the part-time role on the side, and then growing it. And maybe one day it ends up taking off and becomes a legitimate spot for news and analysis, and takes not only on the CFL, but anything related to Canadian football, because we cover kids playing in the NCAA. Chase Claypool would be a good example, coming through the ranks at the University of Notre Dame and being picked by the Pittsburgh Steelers and becoming a stud rookie. We've covered everything on Claypool in his rookie year with the Steelers. So that was Drew Edwards' vision, and it's been carried out, even though he's since moved on to a different profession. So really all the credit goes to Drew.
So for yourself, then, you played quarterback and were a student at Guelph University during the late 2000s. Was communications and sports media something that you always wanted to get into, or how did you embark on this path and navigate your way to where you are currently? Because you mentioned that you worked for Sportsnet during that time when you were first being a part-time contributor at Three Down Nation.
I was certainly curious about it, and some of the kids now might not remember, but you used to have to get physical hard copies of magazines and newspapers. So I can remember back when I was a kid growing up in rural Guelph, Ontario, that I would always run down the laneway at our family farm and check if Sports Illustrated was in the mailbox yet, because I wanted to get that copy, and I would just devour it, man. I would go through everything. And then, once I got a little bit older and had a radio in my room, I was always listening to the Fan 590. So I just was tapped into sports and loved it. Obviously played a bunch of sports growing up when I was a kid, really started focusing on football, especially when I got to high school. And then after my career at the University of Guelph, and even during it, I should say, we had a local CTV reporter. His name was Darren Stevenson, worked for CTV Kitchener, who was covering our team. He had worked at TSN before and was at CTV Kitchener as a sports reporter for a long time, and sports anchor too. And he would come to our practices, and I would say, hey, D, I got to know him pretty well. Say, hey, D, how did you get in this profession, or what's it like? And he started showing me the ropes a little bit. I went and shadowed him for a couple weeks in the summer and thought, hey, I want to really try it out. So after my 5th year at Guelph, I started all 5 years at quarterback. I thought, I really want to get into this. So I got fortunate that there was an independent newspaper at the University of Guelph that actually paid money. So instead of me paying to go to J school, like, a lot of other people do, I sort of joke around that I got paid to learn on the job with the Ontarian, the student newspaper at Guelph, and just continue to make connections and rise up from there. I was fortunate when I played that the Score carried our games. It used to be called University Rush. So Tim McAuliffe, as many people know him on Tim and Sid, was the play-by-play man. Donovan Bennett was a sideline guy. He also did analysis as well. I got to know them well. And after I was done at the Ontarian, started doing some freelancing for CFL.ca, even when I was actually still at the Ontarian, made connections with Donovan and Tim. They introduced me to some people at the Score. I got a job there, and then Sportsnet bought the television part of the Score. So I went over to Sportsnet and just carried on since.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. And for those that may not remember, I remember that my brothers and we used to watch exactly just that in the late 2000s, a lot of university football, OUA in particular, on the Score, pre-2012. And they were super exciting. Tim McAuliffe, outstanding play-by-play guy. It was really fun to watch as a fan. And then I'm sure that it must have been even more fun to actually be involved with, especially when you love football as much as you do.
Yeah, man, nothing beats playing. And I'll tell you, Tim McAuliffe, for people who don't know, is one of the best dudes out there. The guy just loves Canadian sports. And when he was calling these games, he put so much into it. He wanted to make sure he had all the knowledge and treated all of the players with respect in terms of calling the game. There's some people, I think, that show up and they think, well, I just need to walk into the booth and look at the roster and call the game. Well, no, you got to do the background research. So Tim McAuliffe did that very well. And then as I got in at Sportsnet and sort of kept knocking on doors and just trying to get my opportunities, I started doing sidelines for the Canadian University games that Sportsnet was airing, and really got to know Arash Madani, who I think is the top reporter in the country, no matter what sport you put him on. And he's been a mentor to me as well. So I've sort of had three key mentors to me up to this point. I would say Drew Edwards is certainly one. I joke around that I went to the Drew Edwards School of Journalism, especially for writing. He taught me a hell of a lot. Tim McAuliffe helped me get going, and then Arash Madani as well.
So in terms of your current role with 3 Nation, there's several other contributors that produce outstanding work related to Canadian content in football, whether there be guys that play in the NCAA, guys that play in the NFL, or guys that transfer from the CFL to the NFL and get opportunities. So what kind of goals or visions do you have in particular for the future of the website? And how do you try to bring engaging content to fans and to readers in order to keep them interested and to keep them hungry for more?
Well, certainly we need to continue to grow it from the business side. That's something that I really need to learn a lot about and have literally no knowledge about. I'm developed more on the content side, but for 3 Nation to really thrive and grow and evolve in the future, the business aspect needs to grow. So we're working hard on that as well. And then in terms of the content, our mandate, so to speak, when we were under Drew Edwards, and a guy that I said is very well respected, was to always be live to the news. So especially if it's major news, we want to have it up. And first, ideally, we're breaking it. And that's sort of where I've made my money, so to speak, is breaking news. So it gives the site of cachet the more and more that you can break news. So that's been our number one pillar, is breaking news and being live to it. And then our bread and butter has been the analysis, that the people that we have writing for the site, especially myself and John Hodge, who's my main man right now with it, we believe we bring unique insight and analysis beyond the breaking news, and that is why people want to continue coming to the site, because we can tell you what's going on behind the scenes in the league, and in a lot of ways we could probably tell you what we think could happen. Now, there's obviously things that come out of nowhere and stuff that you can't predict, but because, and I'll just speak for myself, I'm constantly talking to people in the league, I can say, hey, this is going to happen, and the next day it does, so to speak. So let's say, for example, Zach Collaros and his contract restructuring negotiations. Well, a lot of people didn't think there was too much going on there, but I was on the Rod Peterson show out in Regina and told them on a Friday that, hey, this is getting close, and they're just sort of tinkering with the numbers a little bit. They have the hard number, and sure enough, the next day it was done. And that's the unique analysis insight to go along with the breaking news that I believe we can provide and continue to further ourselves in terms of not only just written, but video and podcast as well.
So you've made a name for yourself as a bit of a rap sheet, or Adam Schefter, I guess, so to say, for Canadian football, and being able to provide insider information along with another CFL insider and former Huddle Up guest Farhan Lalji. So talk a bit about how you got into the role of being able to acquire or build relationships with those that would be able to provide you with insider info, and how you've handled the great power and great responsibility that comes with your role.
Now, I don't want to give away too many of the secrets, but to be honest, I had sort of a base because I played university football in Canada, and there's obviously a lot of Canadians because it's called the Canadian Football League. So what I did was, largely starting out, I covered the CFL draft because I felt like there wasn't a lot of coverage on it. And in my mind, it's a main talent pipeline that these teams use to get the 7 Canadian starters that they need on their roster. So that's why I felt it was so important. So from feeling that there was a lack of it, I just really dug into that and went after it. And to be quite honest, I didn't necessarily see myself going down the road of breaking as much news as I'm able to now, or even having the Rolodex that I have now. But it was just that keen focus on covering the CFL draft. And that sort of evolved into, all right, well, there's a number of Canadians getting various opportunities in the NFL, be that rookie minicamp invites, signing undrafted free agent contracts, or even getting drafted down there. So I started breaking some of that news, and you develop a respect level with the people around the league so that when you call them or you reach out to them in any capacity, they'll actually talk to you, and they understand that when they say off the record, it's off the record, and that doesn't go anywhere else. And also, they understand that I have a passion for covering the Canadian Football League. Do I want to be balanced and do proper journalism? Yes, but I also have a passion for covering the league. And there are lots of people that believe the more the league is covered, the more it's out there, the more likely they are to potentially attract new fans and keep the fans that they have engaged. So that's just a little tidbit into it, because I don't want to give away too much of the secret sauce. But I would say the number one thing would be you got to keep your word, especially when you're talking to high level people.
Well, of course. And like they say, a magician never reveals the secrets. So you got to make sure to keep a decent amount of it underneath your hat. But it's very interesting and intriguing from a fan's perspective to be able to have that same quality of insider information shared and dialogue generated around what is happening within the Canadian Football League. And especially because the CFL does so many things well on many levels that the NFL likes to copy, so to say. And what people don't realize is that there is a lot of great content, players, and stories in the CFL, but with there being maybe not as many people reporting on it, the job that you, John, and many others at 3 Nation do is an important part of being able to rally fans and keep discourse going about what's going on in our league, because we can't let this die out. The Canadian Football League is old and storied, and it's truly an amazing spectacle to behold. And I've had the privilege of being able to watch many amazing games. And I'm sure even with yourself being a bit older, you've had an even greater opportunity to watch and recount so many great stories and games.
I would agree, man. And the tricky part going forward for the league is going to be making sure they're getting that younger demographic. And they talk about it all the time, but intrigued by their game. They really need to grab those people, because there's a generation. And I'll give you an example. All the guys that I played with, and I'm 34 years old right now, at the University of Guelph, my last year there was 2009. They're all into the NFL. None of my buddies watch the CFL except for a couple, and really only one of them is a diehard CFL guy. He's a big Argos fan. Shout out Dan LeGrelli. So that's, I believe, a missed, let's say, group that the CFL doesn't have right now for whatever reason. And if you sort of go back to that time frame of when they would have got them, the league was in some financial trouble, so maybe they didn't have the marketing dollars. But you see what the NFL is doing on a number of fronts. And let's just talk about one of the most recent fun ones that they had, the Bears Saints game, and it was on Nickelodeon. They had actually a Canadian, Nate Burleson, on the call of the game, but it was tailored toward kids. And a lot of kids seemed to enjoy it. And you got feedback from some of the parents. And I've heard some smart takes on it and saying, well, you know, the parents might not necessarily be into, let's say, Paw Patrol, but the kids are. So I'll give you an example. My nieces and my nephews, I should say, and my niece are into all that stuff. I know all the names of Paw Patrol because they know it. So if you get the kids' attention at a young age, then you might just get them for life. So that's where I really feel like there is a group that the CFL has missed, but that doesn't mean that they can't go get the younger crowd. And I really think they need to find some ways to engage that younger crowd in cool, unique ways. And obviously online is going to be a big key. So I think that's what, you know, we're hoping the league can do, because we want those younger demographic people as well. Our readership at 3 Nation, to give you an idea, is split about 50-50 between, let's say, the 40 plus group and the under 40 group. But you still want more of that younger crowd, and as much as you can get it, because then you're ingraining them for life. Because the people that are over 40 that read our site are dedicated, loyal CFL fans. They love the league through thick and thin, through potential bankruptcy, all the way to the best financial times that they've had. So that's really what the CFL needs to do in the future.
100%. And the younger demographic is only going to serve the league in the future going forward, as they will be the future of the league in terms of fans. And to cater to only people who are in the older demographic, you know, it's not that you shouldn't cater to them at all, but they are, like you said, loyal through thick and thin, through desperate times, desperate measures, expansion to the US, bankruptcy, amazing times, amazing financial flourishing. So the younger demographic, and I'm going to be honest, I thought the pairing up with Nickelodeon was a bit strange at first, but I could really start to see, or take off the rose gold glasses and really start to see some of the marketing techniques behind. If we intrigue kids and get them fixed on this craze of watching NFL games, then pretty soon they're going to become consumers of the league. And that's a long-term relationship that we're building with potential future fans. And that's only going to help serve the league better going into the future. So if the CFL is able to find a way to make a connection like that, maybe whether it be through a television partnership or something that they do content creation wise, then that's only going to help the CFL, and they won't maybe have to be worried about falling on desperate measures or hard times if there are different things that come up in which the league doesn't know how to handle. So we're getting towards the end of our time here, Justin. So I wanted to ask you one final wrap-up question before we go. So what is to you the most memorable play of your university career?
Oh, buddy. Wow. To pick just one is pretty tough, but I suppose the one I think about the most would have been homecoming 2009. We were playing against what used to be the University of Western Ontario, now is Western University, the Mustangs. And we had a homecoming crowd, which pretty much always sells out at Guelph, at least in my time there, it did, of 10,000 plus people. They got a cool bowl that they set up there at the stadium. There's students all over, and it's just a really, really fun atmosphere to play football in. And I remember, I think it was in the first half, flipping into the end zone. There's a touchdown run, and I get up, and I'm, of course, all jacked up, and the crowd's fired up. And I think it was a TD that gave us the lead at that point. But I remember getting back to the sideline. I'm thinking, I can't see out of my left eye. And as I was walking back to the sideline, it was kind of weird because I only had this sort of one line of sight, if that makes sense. And my left eye had gone blurry because I'd hit my head so hard from flipping into the end zone. But there's no way I was coming out of that game. And with all the talk of people looking at football and the head injuries and concussions and all that stuff, I kind of look back on that moment. I think that's why it's one that sticks in my head, that was like, yeah, maybe if it was 10 years later, I would have been out of the game and there would have been some concussion protocol. But to be quite honest, I'm happy that there wasn't, because there was no way you were pulling me off the field in that game. So that's a memory that sticks out to me, obviously, for a number of reasons. The atmosphere was just epic and electric, and scoring a touchdown to put us ahead, plus that tenacity, which is what I like to approach my career now with, to say, no, you're not taking me out of the game. I don't care if I can only see in my left eye for the rest of the second half or the rest of the game. I'm playing. So that's a very memorable play for me.
It was basically the CIS at the time version of the John Elway helicopter run when they were playing the Green Bay Packers in the Super Bowl, and he's 37 years old and just ragdolls when the defender nails him down at the 4-yard line. But he was going to do everything through hell or high water to score that touchdown and to be able to get at least down close to scoring, especially after having lost more Super Bowls than any other starting quarterback in NFL history. But Justin, that's an incredible story. And I want to thank you for having been on today's episode. It was an immense pleasure. And I'm really glad that we're able to talk CFL football, talk a bit of insider stuff and a bit about yourself, because you're a very, very, intriguing figure in the world of Canadian football and are on your way to becoming, the full-time rap sheet, as they say in the NFL, of the CFL. And maybe, who knows, you may end up getting an opportunity down the road across the border with all the great work you've been doing.
Thanks, Matthias, man. I appreciate the kind words. Appreciate you having me on also as well. And keep doing your thing with Huddle Up. And always down to talk football, because the more we're talking football, the better it is, I think, for everyone.
Absolutely. And with that, everyone, thank you for listening to today's episode with CFL Insider and 3 Down Nation man, Justin Dunk.